It started with nothing more than a moment, the kind that happens thousands of times every weekend in crowded rooms filled with music, movement, and noise. A brief misunderstanding, a brush of shoulders, a split second of emotion, the kind of moment everyone forgets by the next song. But this time, it didn't fade. This time, it grew. And before anyone realized what was happening, that single moment began a chain of consequences that could never be undone. What makes stories like this so haunting is how ordinary they begin. There was no warning sign in the air, no sense that the night would be remembered for anything other than laughter and celebration. People gathered with the simple intention of enjoying themselves, stepping briefly outside the pressures of daily life. Music played, conversations overlapped, and the room moved as one living crowd. Inside that shared space, a small interaction took place, one that, in a different timeline, would have meant nothing at all. Moments like these usually vanish instantly. A misunderstanding passes, a glance is misread, a reaction feels sharper than intended. Most of the time, apologies happen without words. The crowd shifts, the night continues. But sometimes, emotion catches hold of the moment instead of releasing it. A feeling of embarrassment becomes irritation. Irritation hardens into resentment, and resentment searches for meaning where none truly exists. What transforms a harmless moment into something far heavier is not the action itself, but the meaning placed upon it. In crowded spaces, there is no room for perfect clarity. Intentions blur, movements overlap. But when pride becomes involved, the mind begins to rewrite the story. What was accidental becomes personal. What was brief becomes deliberate. And what was forgettable becomes unforgettable. From the outside, no one notices the shift at first. The atmosphere remains the same. The music doesn't stop. Laughter still rises above the noise. People dance, drinks are raised, conversations continue. The night appears untouched, yet inside a single individual, the experience replays again and again, gaining weight with every repetition. The moment grows larger than it ever truly was. This is how one moment gains power, not through impact, but through attention. The more it is replayed, the more it changes shape. The mind fills in gaps with assumptions. Silence becomes proof. Distance becomes intention. And soon, what began as nothing more than a brief interaction is transformed into something that feels serious, meaningful, and impossible to ignore. As time moves forward, the memory does not fade into the background as most do. Instead, it becomes a reference point. It reshapes how the rest of the night is seen. Every passing hour gives it more space to settle. And as the crowd eventually disperses and people return to their routines, the feeling remains, carried quietly into the next day. What makes this story especially difficult is how unaware everyone else remains. While one person carries the weight of the moment, dozens of others leave behind only memories of music and laughter. Life continues exactly as it should. Messages are exchanged, plans are made. The holiday passes. The world keeps moving forward, unaware that a single memory is quietly gaining power in the background. This is the fragile truth about moments. They do not need to be dramatic to be dangerous. They only need to be interpreted through the wrong lens. When emotion becomes the storyteller, facts slowly lose their shape. And when meaning is built on assumption instead of reality, the outcome becomes unpredictable. For the person who holds on to that memory, the sense of being wronged grows steadily. With time, the event becomes part of personal identity. It is no longer about what happened, but about what it represents. Respect, pride, control, feeling seen or unseen. These are powerful forces. They turn simple moments into emotional anchors that pull the future in their direction. Meanwhile, the person at the center of that moment remains completely unaware of the role they now play in someone else's story. They carry on with life as normal. They return to familiar routines. They make plans. They think about the future. They remember the night only as another memory among many. In their world, nothing has changed. And that is what makes this turning point so tragic. Two realities now exist side by side, completely disconnected. In one, the moment is already over. In the other, it has barely begun. As days pass, the memory is revisited again and again. Each time, it feels more solid, more justified, more real. The emotional weight grows heavier than the truth ever was. And in the absence of closure, the mind begins to search for resolution on its own, guided not by reason, but by feeling. There's a dangerous transformation that happens when emotions remain unresolved. They begin to define intention. They frame future choices. They influence how chance encounters are interpreted, and eventually, they begin to shape action. At that point, the original moment no longer matters. It has already been replaced by the story built around it. The tragedy lies in how preventable this transformation is. A single conversation could have changed everything. A moment of clarity, a pause, a reminder that crowded spaces create confusion, not calculation. But when silence replaces understanding, imagination fills the space instead. And imagination untethered from truth can become heavier than reality itself. For those who stand outside the story, the outcome feels impossible to reconcile with its beginning. How could something so small lead to something so devastating? How could a night meant for celebration give way to permanent loss? The answer lies not in the moment itself, but in what was allowed to grow from it. Every life touched by this story shares the same disbelief. Families who woke up to ordinary mornings suddenly found themselves in extraordinary grief. Friends who shared memories were left with questions that offered no comfort. A future that once felt open became permanently altered by something that never should have carried such weight. And all of it traces back to a single instant that in another world would have faded into nothing. This story stands as a reminder of how fragile the line truly is between ordinary and irreversible. It reveals how quickly emotion can reshape meaning and how easily misunderstanding can become motive when left unchecked. It shows us that the most powerful turning points are not always loud, dramatic, or obvious. Sometimes they arrive quietly, dressed as nothing at all. The truth is, no one enters a crowded room believing that one small moment will follow them into the rest of their life. No one expects that a glance, a movement, or a misunderstanding will one day be spoken of not as a moment, but as a beginning. Yet this is how many tragedies quietly take form. One moment becomes a memory becomes a meaning becomes a decision, and a decision becomes a consequence that stretches far beyond those who made it. This is why the smallest moments deserve the greatest care, not because they are dangerous on their own, but because of what they can become when emotion is allowed to lead without understanding. In a world full of crowded spaces and shared movement, restraint, patience, and clarity are often the only barriers between an ordinary ending and an unimaginable one. And this is the heartbreaking truth at the center of this story, that something that never mattered in the moment went on to matter forever.
And this is the heartbreaking truth at the center of this story, that something which never mattered in the moment went on to matter forever. What followed did not move in a straight line. It moved outward, quietly at first, like a ripple spreading across still water. One feeling passed to another person, one reaction influenced another response, and soon the impact reached far beyond the original moment. This is the hidden reality of rage. It never belongs to just one person. It travels. Rage rarely begins as something overwhelming. It often starts as discomfort, embarrassment, or frustration. These emotions feel familiar, manageable, even harmless. Most people experience them and let them fade. But when those emotions are held onto instead of released, they begin to change shape. What was once discomfort becomes fixation. What was once frustration becomes a story the mind keeps rewriting. And with every retelling, the emotional charge intensifies. The danger is not only in what anger feels like in the moment, but in how it reshapes perception over time. Small details are exaggerated. Neutral memories become loaded with meaning. Silence becomes confirmation. Absence becomes intention. The mind starts searching for patterns that were never there. And in that search, it begins to justify reactions that would have once seemed unthinkable. While this inner process unfolds, the outside world continues as normal. People go to work. Families make plans. Friends exchange messages. Laughter still exists. Everyday life flows forward, unaware that one person's emotional world is quietly warping under the weight of unresolved feeling. This separation between inner chaos and outer normalcy is what makes the ripple effect so hard to detect until it is too late. Rage does not stay contained within the person who feels it. It leaks into conversations, tone, posture, and behavior. Others begin to sense a shift, even if they cannot explain it. Responses grow sharper. Patience shortens. Neutral interactions feel tense. And gradually that emotional charge spreads through proximity alone. People close to the source may begin to feel unsettled without knowing why. This is how the ripple widens. One unresolved emotion creates tension. That tension influences reactions. Those reactions influence others, and before long the original cause is forgotten, but its emotional consequences continue to circulate. The moment itself fades from clarity, yet the atmosphere it created remains. What makes this ripple so destructive is that it often disguises itself as certainty. The person at its center becomes convinced of their narrative. Doubt feels like weakness. Letting go feels like losing. And in that rigid state of mind, emotions stop being signals and start being commands. When that happens, the ability to pause, reflect, or reconsider begins to disappear. Another layer of danger lies in reinforcement. When emotions are shared with the wrong audience, they gain strength instead of resolution. Words spoken in frustration can be repeated, reshaped, and amplified. Each repetition removes nuance and adds conviction. Echoes replace truth. Suddenly, an emotion that began in isolation feels validated by repetition alone. At that point, rage no longer feels like a passing reaction. It feels like a mission. The mind seeks balance not through understanding but through action. And when action is driven by emotion rather than clarity, consequences multiply far beyond the original intention. The tragedy is that while this internal storm builds, others remain unaware of how close the ripple is to reaching them. They live inside the assumption that the past is over, that misunderstandings fade naturally, that time heals what it touches. For most situations, this is true, but when emotion is held too tightly, time does not heal it. Time sharpens it. This is how innocent lives become part of a story they never chose. Not because of intention, not because of involvement, but because ripples do not discriminate. They move through anyone standing in their path. Families become part of a narrative they never imagined. Friends are pulled into questions they never expected to answer. Communities absorb shock they never saw approaching. What makes the ripple effect so destructive is not only the outcome, but the contrast between intention and impact. Few people wake up planning to change multiple lives forever. But when emotion becomes the driving force, foresight shrinks. The future becomes invisible. Only the present feeling exists. And feelings, no matter how real they seem, cannot predict the scale of what they create. Once the ripple expands beyond a single person, it becomes irreversible. Even if regret appears immediately, even if clarity returns too late, the wave continues. Words cannot retrieve what emotion has already pushed forward. Apologies cannot rewind the chain that has already been set in motion. The direction of the ripple cannot be changed once it has passed a certain point. In the aftermath, those affected are left searching for explanations that never fully satisfy. They look backward, tracing every moment, every interaction, every silence, trying to locate the precise point where everything could have shifted differently. But the truth is, the shift did not happen at one clear moment. It happened slowly, invisibly, inside a mind wrestling with itself. Rage also deceives by offering the illusion of control. In the grip of strong emotion, action feels purposeful, decisive, powerful. It feels like movement after stagnation. But control driven by emotion is not controlled at all. It is surrender disguised as authority. The emotion is no longer being managed, it is managing the person. For the people left behind in the wake of that ripple, the emotional landscape changes forever. Ordinary days now carry extraordinary weight. Simple memories become reminders. Ordinary routines feel unfamiliar. Life must be rebuilt around an absence that never should have existed, and no explanation ever fully closes that gap. Communities, too, feel the ripple long after the moment has passed. Trust shifts. Safety feels fragile. Conversations change tone. People become more alert, more guarded, more aware of how quickly ordinary moments can turn. The story becomes a silent reference point, a reminder passed in hushed voices and cautious glances. Perhaps the most painful dimension of the ripple effect is how it spreads guilt in every direction. Some feel guilt for what they did. Others feel guilt for what they didn't do, for what they didn't notice, for what they didn't say, for the moment they stayed silent when they might have spoken. Rage creates consequences, but silence often shares in the weight that follows. And yet within this devastating chain lies a truth that demands attention. This did not begin with something extreme. It began with something small, something that could have been resolved, released, or forgotten. The scale of the impact did not match the size of the original moment. That imbalance is what makes the story so hard to process. This is why stories like this matter, not because they shock, but because they reveal how quickly emotional choices can shape physical reality. They show how the line between ordinary life and irreversible change is far thinner than we like to believe. They remind us that anger is not always loud, and danger is not always obvious. If the ripple teaches anything, it is that emotional restraint is not weakness. It is protection, not just for oneself, but for everyone connected through unseen threads. A moment of patience can prevent a lifetime of consequences. A pause can stop a chain reaction. A conversation can dissolve what silence turns into certainty. The ripple effect of rage does not announce itself. It begins quietly, disguised as a feeling that seems justified, personal, even private. But emotions are never truly private. They always leak outward. They always touch others. And when they do, the world shifts in ways that cannot be undone. The saddest truth is that by the time the full reach of that ripple is understood, the opportunity to stop it has already passed. What remains are questions, memories, and the heavy knowledge that something so small created something so permanent. And so, the story does not only warn about anger itself, it warns about what happens when anger is allowed to grow unattended, unquestioned, and unresolved. Because when rage moves from feeling to force, it no longer belongs to just one person. It becomes a current that pulls everyone into its path.
And once the ripple has passed, what remains is not just damage, but reflection. The long, quiet process of understanding how a single decision can reshape so many lives. This is where the third truth emerges, not as sudden shock, but as slow awareness. The realization that every choice carries weight, and some choices carry far more than the moment ever suggests. In the early stages after everything changes, time feels distorted. Days move strangely. Some moments pass in silence. Others feel impossibly loud. People begin replaying conversations they once took for granted. Small details gain new meaning. A look, a word, a pause. Everything is examined through the lens of what happened afterward. This is how consequence teaches its hardest lessons, not with clarity, but with endless questions. For those closest to the center of the story, life no longer follows the path it once promised. Plans collapse. Futures shift direction. Dreams once discussed casually now feel unreachable. And yet, the world outside continues. Traffic flows. Shops open. Conversations continue in places untouched by the loss. This contrast between private grief and public normalcy becomes one of the heaviest burdens to carry. Choice often feels simple in the moment it is made. It feels like an action isolated in time, a response to pressure, a reaction to emotion, a decision framed as necessary or justified. Rarely does it feel like the moment everything will change. The future is invisible in that instant. Only the feeling exists. And when feeling leads without reflection, it can outrun consequence by just enough time to create irreversible distance. What makes consequence so powerful is not only what it removes, but what it leaves behind. Absence becomes part of daily life. Silence fills spaces that once held voices. ordinary routines carry unfamiliar weight. Even happiness, when it returns, feels different. It arrives softened by memory, cautious, aware of how fragile everything truly is. For families, the weight of consequence is not measured in headlines or timelines. It is measured in empty chairs, unfinished conversations, and milestones that arrive without the person who should have been there. Birthdays pass differently. Seasons change differently. The future is no longer imagined as it once was, because imagination now carries limits shaped by loss. For friends, consequence becomes memory mixed with distance. Shared laughter feels both comforting and painful. Old messages are reread with new meaning. Inside jokes carry a quiet ache. And the question returns again and again, not as accusation, but as longing. What would life look like now if one moment had unfolded differently? For communities, consequence reshapes the sense of safety and certainty. Places that once felt ordinary now carry echoes of what happened. Streets feel quieter. Crowded rooms feel heavier. Conversations change tone. Awareness sharpens. People begin to understand, in a way they never did before, how quickly life can turn. And at the center of this widening circle of consequence stands the truth that cannot be escaped. Everything began with a choice. Not a grand decision, not a life-defining plan, just a moment where emotion stood at a crossroads with restraint, and restraint did not take the lead. This is the hardest part of the story to face, not because it is complex, but because it is simple. The idea that the outcome did not require something extraordinary to begin, only something human, a reaction, a feeling, a moment without pause. In the quiet aftermath, reflection becomes unavoidable. People begin to ask not only what happened, but why. And beneath that question lies another, even heavier one. What could have been different? Reflection does not change the past, but it reshapes how the future is understood. It teaches, not through comfort, but through contrast. This is where accountability finds its meaning, not as punishment alone, but as recognition. Recognition that actions extend beyond intention. Recognition that consequences do not negotiate with justification. Recognition that once a decision is released into the world, it belongs not only to the one who made it, but to everyone it touches. Choice is often described as freedom. And it is, but it is also responsibility. Every decision sends a direction forward in time. Most fade harmlessly, some grow quietly, and a few reshape everything. The difference is rarely visible in the moment. It reveals itself only after the path has already shifted. For those who look back from the far side of consequence, clarity often arrives too late. The understanding of what should have been done or left undone becomes painfully sharp only after the cost is fully known. This is the quiet cruelty of hindsight. It offers perfect vision when the moment to act has already passed. Yet, within this reflection lies a purpose beyond regret. It becomes a warning written not in words, but in experience. It becomes a message carried into every future choice, a reminder that emotion must never be the only voice in a decision, that pause is not weakness, that walking away is not defeat, that silence, at the right moment, can be the loudest form of protection. For those who hear this story without being directly touched by it, reflection still carries weight. It becomes a mirror held up to ordinary moments. It changes how small conflicts are seen. It changes how much power is recognized in a single reaction. It quietly asks a question that lingers long after the story ends. What would I do differently if I truly understood the full reach of one decision? The truth is, no one is defined by a single moment alone, but some moments define paths that cannot be undone. And the responsibility of knowing that truth is not meant to frighten, but to awaken awareness. Awareness of how closely everyday life and irreversible change can exist side by side. As time moves forward, those affected learn to carry both memory and movement at once. They learn to live with what cannot be changed while continuing to step into what still can be shaped. This balance is never easy, but it is the only way forward. And through that forward movement, the story continues to speak, not with sound, but with presence.
It speaks in choices made more carefully, in reactions held back, in conflicts softened before they grow, in patience extended where anger might have answered. This is the final lesson hidden beneath everything, that while one decision can create permanent consequence, another decision can prevent it. That reflection does not exist only for the past, it exists to protect the future. The real legacy of this story is not only what was lost, but what it teaches every person who hears it. That control is more powerful than reaction, that restraint is stronger than impulse, that what feels small in the moment can carry the weight of a lifetime. And so, as this chapter closes, what remains is not only sorrow, but responsibility. Responsibility to measure moments before they harden into meaning. Responsibility to pause when emotions rise. Responsibility to remember that every choice, no matter how brief, writes something into the future. Because in the end, this is not only a story about what happened, it is a story about what can still be prevented. And that truth, carried forward with honesty and care, may be the only part of the ripple that has the power to heal rather than harm. If you want to uncover the stories hidden in the shadows, hit subscribe and join us for the next chapter.